So Leibniz famously writes that each substance is like a world apart, independent of all other things except for God. Now, according to, well, the very early reading, I would say, no longer the standard reading of Émilie du Châtelet's Metaphysics as laid out in her Foundations, this is a reading, again, that has come under increasing pressure in recent commentaries. Du Châtelet's Metaphysics is inherited from Leibniz. But, what seems to be quite a remarkable departure from Leibniz's world apart doctrine, I'm going to argue that Du Châtelet seems to endorse the view that substances stand in genuine causal relations to one another. Now, this apparent endorsement of transient causation between substances does sit quite oddly with Du Châtelet's own claim in her preface that her goal in the first chapters is to explain the principal opinions of Mr. Leibniz on metaphysics, as she puts it. And there are really good questions about why Du Châtelet comes apart from Leibniz with respect to her views about causation. Just had some really helpful comments on this from Clara that have made me think really hard about this. So there's a lot to explore here. Why does she come apart from Leibniz here, and why does she nevertheless attribute her metaphysics to Leibniz? But for the purposes of this talk, what I'll do is just focus on this different question. Does Du Châtelet have the resources to respond to Leibniz's worry that physical influx is metaphysically incoherent? So, as some of you might know, Leibniz has a variety of objections to physical influx or transient intersubstantial causation. I'll use this interchangeably here. But one particular objection says that, well, such influx is metaphysically incoherent because it involves the transfer of an accident from one substance to another, and that is metaphysically incoherent. Okay, so given that Leibniz has that objection, does Du Châtelet, given that she may still be characterized as a Leibnizian in some sense, have the resources to respond to that worry? So then just looking at the handout, here are my two main aims for this talk. First, show that Du Châtelet is in fact committed to transient causal interaction between substances. So, perhaps this is somewhat controversial, so I'll make a detailed case for that. And second, I'll discuss how she's able to overcome Leibniz's objection that transient intersubstantial causation or physical influx requires the transfer of an accident from one substance to another, and that such a transfer is metaphysically incoherent. So why think that Du Châtelet, unlike Leibniz, is committed to transient causal interaction between substances? And again, my focus here is going to be on substances, even though I'll be talking about causal interaction between bodies as well on her view. Okay, so the thing that I want to establish is that she's committed to transient causal interaction between substances, and where her substances are simple. For her, there are no composite substances. Okay, I'm going to make a claim that make this claim that she has this indirect argument for this claim that there's interaction between substances, there's causal interaction between substances, and it's going to be indirect because it starts with this premise about interaction between bodies. And I've sort of put I've put this argument on the handout, and then I'll talk about some of the premises in more detail. Okay, so this is what I'm calling the argument from interaction between bodies. So premise one, bodies stand in transient causal relations to one another. Premise two, the original reason for the connection, between bodies to I think there's a typo somewhere here. Okay, the original reason for the connection that bodies have to one another lies in the connection between simples. And so conclusion, simples stand in transient causal relations to one another. Okay, so why think that Du Châtelet is committed to P1, that bodies stand in transient causal relations to one another? So consider first this passage. I think this is just one representative passage where she talks about bodies acting on one another. And this comes at section 259. So she writes, this resistance that all bodies present when one wants to change their current state is the foundation of the third law of motion, by which the reaction is always equal to the action. The establishment of this law was necessary so that bodies might act on one another, and that motion, being once produced in the universe, might be communicated from one body to another with sufficient reason. Okay, so again, this is some evidence, and there are other passages where she also commits herself to this, that bodies act on one another. And this suggests that she doesn't endorse transient causal relations between bodies. But then, she also goes on to say that the connections that obtain between bodies are ultimately explained by the connections that obtain between simples. So here's the passage where she says that at 131, the original reasons for all that happens in bodies lie necessarily in the elements of which they are composed. It follows that the original reason for the connection of bodies to each other, insofar as they coexist and succeed each other, lies in simple beings. So the connection of the parts of the world depends on the connection of the elements, which is the foundation and the first origin. Okay, so we have P1, that these causal relations obtained between bodies. P2, that the causal relations that obtain between bodies are ultimately explained by the relations that obtain between simples. And so conclusion, there are transient causal relations that obtain between simples. Now, there are a couple of, background assumptions here. One, we're assuming that the relation that obtains between bodies is not further analyzable. So, if the causal relation obtains between bodies, then, and if in virtue of relations between simples, then the relation that obtains between simples is also a causal one, as opposed to something more basic. Okay, so that's one assumption here that I just want to highlight. But I think it's I think it's plausible that Du Châtelet is committed to that. So that's the first argument that I have here for why Du Châtelet is committed to transient causal interaction between substances. But there's also a second argument that on the handout I've called the argument from Du Châtelet's account of change. So again, unlike Leibniz, Du Châtelet distinguishes between features of a being that are essential to it and those that are variable. And this is a distinction that presupposes the possibility of intersubstantial causation. So attributes, she writes, have their sufficient reason in the essential determinations of a being, but these essential properties determine only the possibility of modes, since if the essential determinations contain the reason for the actuality of the modes would become attributes, since it would be impossible for them not to be found in the being. And this distinction between modes as modes that are variable and attributes basically commits her to an account where there's intersubstantial causation, transient intersubstantial causation between substances. Okay, I'll have more to say about this case, but maybe I'll move on to Leibniz's objection. Okay, so in light of the fact that Du Châtelet seems to be committed to intersubstantial causation, does she have the resources to respond to Leibniz's objection that influx is metaphysically incoherent? Now, again, there are good questions here about whether she was even aware that Leibniz has this objection. So as several other commentators have pointed out, her knowledge of Leibniz was somewhat limited because it came through Wolff. And so it's not really clear that she was even aware that that was this, that Leibniz had this, according to Leibniz, devastating objection to physical influx. Nevertheless, I think just on philosophical grounds, we might ask this question, is her account of influx or intersubstantial causation metaphysically coherent? And relatedly, does it require a transfer of accidents from one substance to another? So you might think that, well, Leibniz's objection only arises on the assumption that there's a transfer of accidents, but, and several writers who came after Leibniz Wolff, for example, did not necessarily endorse that model, did not endorse that model of influx. And so what is du Châtelet's model for influx, given that she seems committed to it? So lots of questions here. So first, let's just walk through Leibniz's argument against influx. And again, Leibniz has several arguments, but I'm focusing on the argument from the metaphysical coherence of physical influx. Again, I've put this in standard form just for easy reference. So premise 1 here says that accidents are by definition dependent beings. And so they cannot exist unattached to substance. So accidents have to inhere in substance at all times. Premise 2, transient causation requires the transfer of an accident from one substance to another. Alternatively, one might think that an accident could go out of existence when attached to one substance and then come into existence as attached to a different substance. But this wouldn't really be transfer, but an accident literally coming into being ex nihilo. And this is a possibility that Leibniz would reject because it seems to attribute the power of creation to finite substances. Premise 3, the transfer of an accident from one substance to another entails that there is a moment where the accident has detached from the first substance and not attached to the second. And so there's a moment where it is unattached. This seems to be quite a crude picture of influx, but let's see. Okay, so conclusion 1, there can be no transfer of accidents from one substance to another because such a thing would be metaphysically incoherent. And so conclusion 2, transient causation between substances is impossible. So how might du Châtelet respond to this objection? Okay, now the first thing I wanted to point out is that it's actually somewhat unclear whether du Châtelet endorses an account of physical influx that requires the transfer of an accident from one substance to another. I believe Katherine Brading in her book, in her 2018 book, suggests that du Châtelet does not endorse influx and instead, talks in terms of the communication of force from one substance to another. But actually, looking at the text, I find this a bit unclear. So here's some evidence that du Châtelet does, does think of physical influx in terms of transfer of an accident. Okay, so at 259, quoted earlier on the handout, she speaks of motion, not force, being communicated from one body to another. And motion here is an accident. See also section 227, where she writes, thus any bodies at rest would forever stay at rest if some cause did not set them in motion. As for example, when I withdraw a plank on which a stone is placed, or when some moving body communicates its motion to another body, as when one billiard ball pushes another. But, motion is an accident. It's a mode of a substance. So it seems that, at least as far as bodies are concerned, du Châtelet is committed to something like the transfer of an accident from one body to another. Now, of course, one could have the view that motion, perhaps for du Châtelet, is communicated from one body to another, but not from one substance to another, right? So perhaps she has something like physical influx at the level of bodies, but not, she doesn't endorse that view at the level of simples or substances. But given the argument I gave earlier, where du Châtelet seems to suggest that the connections that obtain between bodies obtain in virtue of connections between simples, it seems that she would need to be connected. She would have to be committed to something like transfer at the level of simples as well. She seems to be committed to the transfer of motion or the communication of motion from a body to another. And any connection between bodies obtains in virtue of a connection between simples. So how could she not then be committed to something like the transfer of motion from one simple to another? Okay, so that is just some very tentative evidence for thinking that du Châtelet is committed to this sort of crude view of physical influx that Leibniz is criticizing. And again, I mean, this is like, is she really committed to this view? I mean, given that she was influenced fairly heavily by Wolff, and Wolff doesn't seem to be committed to this view. What, in fact, where is du Châtelet getting her, commitments from here? Okay, so these are all really good questions. But for now, let us suppose that she is committed to the transfer of accidents, and this is how physical influx happens. In that case, how can we make sense of transient intersubstantial causation in light of Leibniz's objection on du Châtelet's view? And I want to focus on, I'll talk a bit about this passage at section 43, and then I'll engage in some mild rational reconstruction. Okay, so here's the passage. Du Châtelet writes, modes are the limitation of the subject of which they are the modes. Everything that is not in conflict with the essential determinations, even though the essential determinations do not determine them, is a mode. Their possibility, but not their actuality, arises from the essence. Thus, one can understand through these essential determinations why a mode is possible, but not why it becomes actual. For if the essential determinations contain the reason for the actuality of the modes would become attributes, since it would be impossible for them not to be found in the being. Now, what I find striking in this passage is that a mode is defined as that which is not in conflict with the essential determinations of a substance. And defined in this way, a mode may be had in two distinct ways. It may be had actually, or it may be had potentially. And in both cases, whether it's had actually or had potentially, the mode in question inheres in the relevant substance. So here's the sort of view she could have. Okay, so I don't have any direct evidence that she, in fact, has this view, but given what she says about what modes are and how modes inhere in substance, here's the sort of view she could have that does, on the face of it, seem to deal with Leibniz's objection. Prior to transfer, and I've put this on the handout actually, prior to the transfer of an accident from a substance S1 to a substance S2, an accident F is sustained by S1 as an actual mode. Okay, so S1 is holding on to that mode. But it is also sustained by S2 as a potential mode, insofar as it is compatible with its essence. Okay, and after the transfer, so after the transfer, F is sustained by S2 as an actual mode because it makes that leap, but also sustained by S1 and S2 as a potential mode. So as a potential mode, it is in fact sustained or attached throughout the transfer. And there's no point at which it is unattached or walks about freely, without being attached to a substance from one substance to another, as Leibniz would have said. So in a way, we have this kind of, overdetermining grounds here, right? So the mode as actual is grounded, and it's also as potential, and as potential, it is also grounded. But this is actually, okay, so this is the case I want to make, that this is not as weird as the sound, because you might think that, well, in general, it seems really strange to say that something inheres, that an accident F inheres in two distinct substances, right? That it inheres fully in A and it inheres fully in B. That sounds almost incoherent. But now I want to say that, well, once we distinguish two different ways of being a mode, right? Then, or two different ways of inhering, sorry, rather, then there's room to make this claim that it inheres in S1 as potential, and it inheres in S2 as actual. Okay, and this makes, and I think this gets around Leibniz's worry. Just on philosophical grounds. And so I'm reading quite a lot into du Châtelet here, but actually, I'm taking seriously what she says here in section 43, and in particular, how she defines what a mode is. So, okay, again, this is, I'm not saying that du Châtelet is committed to this view, But, you know, if she is committed to intersubstantial causation, and I do think that she is, and if she endorses a version of a physical influx on which there's a transfer of an accident from one substance to another, then she does have the resources to deal with this worry that accidents cannot go about unattached. Okay, maybe I'll stop there. Thank you.